view right now. But Hitchens doesn't know about it, or if he knows, he's not telling. Science and belief are enemies. They're absolutely opposed to one another. Galileo, of course, is invoked, but Galileo is the one who, unbeknownst to Hitchens, said, we read about God in two books, the book of the scriptures and the book of nature. He was a religious man, but he has to be painted as a secularist. One of my favorite cases is Sir Fred Hoyle, probably one of the greatest, most brilliant physicists of the 20th century. He was a British agnostic. But in Hitchens' book, he shows up as a creationist. Some of you may remember, if you grew up about the time I did, there were two viable alternatives for the origin of the universe, the Big Bang and the steady state theory. Fred Hoyle was the founder of the steady state theory. And Hitchens portrays him as being opposed to the Big Bang because the Big Bang threatened his theism. Now, Hoyle was an agnostic or an atheist. He's got it completely turned around. In many cases, Hitchens is 180 degrees wrong. He is so far wrong that if he moved at all, he'd be coming back toward right. But he does this constantly. And in the case of Hoyle, it is amusing. Hoyle was probably having doubts about his atheism toward the end. He's the one, and Hitchens just goes ballistic at this, who said that looking at the theory of evolution, it reminded him of the idea that a storm hits a junkyard, and when it's done, a Boeing 747 has emerged. But he was by no means an ardent Christian. The irony, I might say, about this is that although Hitchens sees the Big Bang as the enemy of religion, guess who was one of the earliest people to just love the Big Bang? He went so far that his advisors criticized him for it and asked him to restrain himself. Pope Pius XII, you know, the pro-Nazi. He thought it was a wonderful thing. It reminded him of Genesis 1. And so he pushed the Big Bang. And not surprisingly. Why? Because this great atheist theory, the Big Bang, was originated to at least a large extent by Georges Lemaitre, who was a Belgian priest and mathematician and physicist. So he's got the history of science turned on its head. He doesn't know what he's talking about. But this is just typical. Here's another amusing part of what he has to say. The loss of faith, he says, can be compensated by the newer and finer wonders that we have before us, as well as by immersion in the near miraculous work of Homer and Shakespeare and Milton and Tolstoy and Proust, all of which was man-made. Now, Homer without religion? What do you make of the story of the, well, anyway. You lose about half of it right there. Tolstoy without religion, he would have been shocked by that. But the one that really gets me is Milton without religion. Here are the opening lines of Paradise Lost. Of man's first disobedience and the fruit of that forbidden tree, whose mortal taste brought death into the world and all our woe, with loss of Eden, till one greater man restore us and regain the blissful seat, sing, heavenly muse. What in me is dark illumine, what is low raise and support, that to the height of this great argument I may assert eternal providence and justify the ways of God to men. That's the purpose statement of Paradise Lost. So, you know, get rid of religion, but read your Milton. Imagine Dante without religion. I've tried to imagine Chaucer's Canterbury Tales without religion. Pilgrimage to what? Where are they going? It sort of reminds me of the joke about, you know, you cross an atheist or an agnostic with a Jehovah's Witness, what do you get? Someone who goes door to door for no obvious reason. You remove religion from Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, and where are they going to go? Well, but he asks us to contemplate a world without religion, and I invite you to contemplate that same world. Imagine a world without Bach's St. Matthew Passion, without Handel's Messiah, without Mozart's Requiem, without Stravinsky, without John Taverner, without John Coltrane, heck, without Brian Wilson. Without cathedrals, without the Blue Mosque in Istanbul. I mean, it's all gone. You cannot imagine that you just get rid of the bad parts of religion and you're still going to have all the good things. You get rid of it all. What are you left with? Instead of the Cathedral of Chartres, maybe a Quonset hut, something purely functional. Well, here's a really serious point. Totalitarian atrocities. The 1997 Black Book of Communism estimates the total deaths caused by communism at between 85 and 100 million. But I think even the highest of those figures may be low. There's a new biography, a relatively new biography of Mao out that credits him with 70 million deaths on his own in peacetime. You've still got to factor in Stalin and Trotsky and Lenin and all those. And then, of course, there are the Nazis. Now, Hitchens realizes that such facts pose a threat to the atheism he advocates, because religion is supposed to be guilty of all these crimes, and secularism will introduce a brave new world of peace and justice and harmony and all that sort of thing, but it doesn't seem to work. So what does he do? He takes a fairly daring step. He declares that religion created totalitarianism. And he points, for example, to the Jesuit reductions in Paraguay. You may remember them from the Robert De Niro movie, The Mission, a really, really fine movie set around Iguazu Falls, a really gorgeous area. That is an early totalitarian state where the Indians were kept in terror and fear by these Jesuit priests. Now, let me tell you about these Jesuit priests. There were 2 of them for every 3,500 Indians who were free to come and go anytime they wanted. What kind of terrorist totalitarian state is that? He's completely misrepresented them. And then he goes on to say that all totalitarianism is religious. It didn't only originate in religion, but all totalitarianism, you thought you knew about Stalin, all totalitarianism is actually theocratic. It's all religious stuff. Believers are guilty for that too. Okay? He says of Saddam Hussein, "I shall simply say that those who regarded his regime as a secular one are deluding themselves." Well, I hereby declare myself deluded. Saddam Hussein was less of a Muslim than I am. And the Ba'athist state was a fascist state. Ba'athist ideology was founded by a lapsed Christian named Michel Aflaq. Saddam Hussein was a nominal Muslim, but his chief deputy, Tariq Aziz, was a Christian, you know, of the kind that Vito Corleone was a Christian, but still a Christian of some sort, at least nominally. What kind of a theocracy is this? After 1979, it's true that Saddam Hussein, being a thug, but a fairly clever thug and a survivor, knew which way the wind was blowing, so he discovered, for example, that he was a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad. And who would dare to question him on that? And then he also put Allahu Akbar on the Iraqi flag, you know, God is most great, because he knew which way the winds were blowing. But he never showed any signs of serious religion. He persecuted religious leaders in Iraq. He killed them by the thousands, Shiite and Sunni both. It wasn't like he only favored the Sunnis. He disliked them all. Anybody who was a threat to him died. So this is a preposterous claim on his part, but here's another one. He's more overt than this, but I happen to love this passage. This is a description of Stalin's experiments with, you may remember Lysenko. If you've ever read about Soviet history, a guy named Trofim Lysenko, who launched a new theory of Marxist genetics. It was insane. You know, reject Mendel and all that sort of scientific nonsense and go with Marxist-Leninist thought on genetics. Lots of people starved to death as a result of his agricultural experiments. So Hitchens, who remember is an ex-Trotskyite who really admires Lenin and Trotsky and the Soviet experiment, says, Stalin pedantically repeated the papal routine. Note that word, papal. Repeated the papal routine of making science conform to dogma by insisting that the shaman and charlatan, shaman, you know, religious language again, the shaman and charlatan Trofim Lysenko had disclosed the key to genetics and promised extra harvests of specially inspired vegetables. Inspired. Millions of innocents died of gnawing internal pain as a consequence of this revelation. Now that is just rhetorical irresponsibility. But notice the religious language: inspiration, revelation, shaman, papal, bringing up the papacy, all of which has to do with a completely atheist regime, a militantly atheist regime. Listen to a description of the death of the great theocrat and believer Stalin. Joseph Stalin died a horrific death in March 1953. He had suffered a severe stroke that left his right side paralyzed, and his last hours were spent in virtually unbearable pain. Slowly, he was strangled to death. As his daughter Svetlana later reported, her father choked to death as those around his deathbed looked on. Although at the very last he had seemed at most merely semi-conscious, he suddenly opened his eyes and looked about the room, plainly terrified. At that point, according to Svetlana, quote, something incomprehensible and awesome happened that to this day I can't forget and don't understand. Stalin partially lifted himself in the bed, clenched his fist toward the heavens and shook it defiantly. Then, with an unintelligible murmur, he dropped motionless back onto his pillow and died. It was a holy death. Now, I'm going to do something here. I'm going to read a somewhat lengthy passage because I want to make a point here. I find Hitchens, in many regards, simply absurd, but in one aspect, obscene. It's his attempt to blame the atrocities of the Nazis and the communists on religious believers. So I want to read this little portion that I've just been putting together in the past couple of days. Lenin wrote to Maxim Gorky in 1913 that, quote, any religious idea is the most dangerous foulness, the most shameful infection, and worship is no more than ideological necrophilia. In 1921, by now firmly in control of the country, he called upon the Communist Party to adopt a program of militant atheism and militant materialism. Now remember,